Harrison Ford pushed back his chair. Not standing, not speaking. Just the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair moving backward across the Tonight Show stage. 4 inches, maybe 6. His hands flat on the armrests. His eyes fixed on something at the back of the studio that no one else could see. Jimmy Fallon froze. His hand was still extended, mid-gesture, suspended in the air where it had been a moment before. He did not lower it. He did not speak. He sat exactly as he was, and 300 people watched Harrison Ford stare at something that wasn't there. His face completely still. Not with the stillness of composure, but with the stillness of a man who has just heard a sound he stopped expecting to hear 40 years ago. It was a Wednesday night taping, October 2022. The Tonight Show. Harrison Ford was the guest, 80 years old, making a rare television appearance. He was there to talk about a film. The audience had arrived in something close to reverence. When he walked out onto that stage, he walked the way men walk who have stopped trying to look like anything other than what they are. Unhurried, grounded, taking up exactly the space he needed, and no more. The audience rose without thinking. He told them to sit down. They didn't, not for a while. The interview had been easy and generous from the first exchange. He was funny in the way very serious people are sometimes funny, dry, precise, never performing it. Jimmy had been loose and warm beside him. The band was settled. The cameras moved quietly. Everything was exactly right. And then, from the monitor behind the main camera, a sound came through the studio speakers that the sound engineer had been asked to play at a specific moment in the interview. Not loud, not produced, not dramatic, just a voice. An old recording, slightly worn at the edges the way old recordings are. A woman's voice, low and clear, speaking 3 words. Harrison Ford's hands moved to the armrests. His fingers pressed down, slowly, deliberately, one at a time. His chin lifted a degree. His eyes traveled to the back of the studio, past the cameras, past the lights, to the darkness near the entrance doors where the studio bled into the corridor beyond. He was not looking at anything that was there. He was looking at something that was somewhere else entirely. At something that was 1974 and a Tuesday afternoon in a room above a hardware store on Greenfield Avenue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Jimmy Fallon's hand hung in the air and did not move. Then Harrison Ford pushed back his chair. Slowly, the legs scraped once against the stage floor. He stopped. He did not stand. He just sat there, 4 inches further from the desk, as if he needed that much more room to hold what was happening inside him. Jimmy leaned forward. He said quietly, "Harrison." Harrison Ford did not answer immediately. His jaw moved once, the way jaws move when a person is working through something without words. Then he said, very quietly, still looking at the back of the studio, "Play it again." The entire studio froze. The sound engineer, in his booth above the audience, looked at the producer in the wing. The producer did not move. The director in the control room did not cut. No one reached for anything. 300 people sat in the specific silence of witnessing something they did not yet understand, wondering if this was part of something planned. Wondering if the 80-year-old man on stage was all right. Wondering what 3 words from an old recording could do to a man who had made his name doing things on screen that cannot be done to ordinary people. Then Harrison Ford turned and looked at Jimmy. His eyes were wet. He said, "It again, please. Play it again." To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1974. Harrison Ford wasn't always Harrison Ford. He wasn't always the face audiences lined up around blocks to see. Not yet the man who would hold the title of highest-grossing film actor in history. Not yet Han Solo, or Indiana Jones, or Jack Ryan. In the spring of 1974, he was 31 years old, a carpenter who sometimes got small parts in films and television, and who had decided, mostly, that the acting was not going to work, and that he was going to be a carpenter, and that this was fine. He was good at carpentry, he was precise and patient, and he liked the work. He had a family. He had a house that needed things done to it. He had accepted, with the particular quiet of a practical man, that the world was not going to arrange itself around his ambitions. He was working a job that spring for a man named Walt Okafor, who owned a building on Greenfield Avenue in Milwaukee. A 2-story commercial property that needed new flooring on the upper level and crown molding throughout, and a staircase that had been pulling away from the wall for 3 years. Harrison had driven up from Los Angeles alone, tools in the bed of his truck, to do the job over 3 weeks. He stayed in a motel 2 blocks from the building. He ate at the same diner every morning. He worked alone. The upper floor of Walt Okafor's building was rented by a woman named Ruth Elaine Beckett, who ran a small music school there. Not a formal academy. 8 students, no sign on the door, word of mouth only. She taught piano and voice to whoever came. She was 43 years old, and she had come to Milwaukee from a small town in Georgia 12 years earlier, following a husband who then left 2 years after they arrived and took with him nearly everything except the upright piano she had brought from her mother's house, and the particular stubbornness that had been in her family for generations. She had started giving lessons to pay the rent on the room above the hardware store. 8 years later, she had 8 students, a waiting list of 4, and a reputation in the neighborhood for being the person who could teach anyone to hear music the way it was meant to be heard. Harrison Ford was not a student. He was a carpenter. He arrived at 7 each morning and worked until the light went. Ruth Beckett arrived at 9 and taught until 4. For 3 weeks they occupied the same small building, nodding in the stairwell, occasionally sharing the single bathroom down the hall, once eating sandwiches on the landing at the same time without planning it. Harrison was not a man who talked easily to strangers. Ruth Beckett was not a woman who needed him to. She was, as he would say many years later to no one in particular, simply not afraid of silence. On the second week, a Thursday afternoon, Harrison was working in the hallway outside her studio when she stopped a lesson mid-piece and asked her student, a girl of about 12, to wait. She opened the door. She looked at Harrison for a moment with the direct, unsentimental assessment of someone who has decided something. She said, "You've been listening." He said, "I can hear through the wall." She said, "I know. I meant you've been listening. Come in." He came in. He stood at the back of the small room with sawdust on his shirt and a hammer still in his belt, and listened to her finish the lesson. When the girl left, Ruth sat back down at the piano and played a piece he didn't recognize, something unhurried and deliberate, built around a left-hand pattern that repeated while the right hand moved above it like a separate conversation. She played it through once, and then stopped and asked him what he heard. He said he wasn't sure. He said it sounded like 2 people talking and not quite reaching each other. She turned on the bench and looked at him. She said, "That is exactly what it sounds like. That is Sati. And you just told me more about that piece than most people who have studied music for years." They talked for 2 hours that afternoon. About sound and what it does to the body before the mind catches up, about the difference between hearing something and being changed by it, about the kind of attention required to really listen to anything, a piece of music, a person, a life, without filling the silence with your own noise. Harrison Ford was not a man who often found himself in a conversation that moved the furniture of his thinking. This one did. He came back the next day, and the next. He finished the job on a Saturday and drove back to Los Angeles on Sunday, and on the drive he could not stop hearing her voice. Not romantically, but in the way a specific person's way of seeing the world settles into you and doesn't leave. He wrote her a letter from Los Angeles. She wrote back. They wrote for nearly a year, about music, about work, about what it meant to do something with your hands, about whether a person could still become something at 31 or 43 that they had not yet been. Her letters were long and precise and funny and unsparing. His were shorter, rougher, and more honest than he intended them to be. And then, in the summer of 1975, everything changed. A director named George Lucas called him in for a meeting. The meeting changed his life. And then the life that changed was not the life of the man who drove to Milwaukee and put new flooring down and listened through a wall to a woman teaching sati. It was the life of something else entirely, something public and enormous and relentless, something that took every hour and filled every room. The letters slowed, then stopped. Not through intention, not through conflict, not through anything except the velocity of what was happening to him and the quietness of who she was. She was not someone who would call him on a studio lot. She was not someone who would find him through a publicist. She was someone who would understand, with the same directness she brought to everything, that his time had passed into a different country, and she would wish him well from the shore. Ruth Beckett taught music above the hardware store on Greenfield Avenue until 1991. She retired. She moved to a smaller apartment near Marquette University, where she could hear the bells. She attended concerts. She read. She kept, in a shoebox, on the top shelf of her closet, every letter Harrison Ford had written to her, bound with a rubber band that she replaced every few years when the old one cracked. She had listened to his films the way she listened to music, not for the spectacle, but for the thing underneath. She had, in her methodical and private way, kept a small, careful record of a friendship that the world had never known existed. In the spring of 2022, Ruth Beckett was diagnosed with a cancer that had already traveled further than anyone would have hoped. Her doctor told her, without cruelty, that she was looking at months, not years. She was 91 years old. She received this information the way she received most information, directly, without flinching, sitting very straight in the chair across from the doctor's desk. She went home. She made tea. She sat at the window and thought for a long time. Then she took out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Harrison Ford. She sent it to his production company. It was addressed by hand. Inside, she wrote 2 pages. She wrote about the spring of 1974 and the Thursday afternoon, and what she had said to him about sati, and what he had said back to her that had surprised her more than she let on. She wrote about the letters and what they had meant. She wrote without sentimentality or self-pity, only with the clear, warm precision that had always been the signature of everything she said. At the bottom of the second page, she had recorded herself reading the letter aloud. She mentioned this in a postscript. The recording was on a small digital file on a USB drive taped to the back of the envelope. She said, "I thought you might want to hear my voice. I thought it might be better that way, after all this time." Harrison Ford's assistant received the letter in June 2022. She brought it to him. He read it in his office, alone, in under 5 minutes. He did not speak for a long time after. Then he called his assistant back in and told her to find out everything she could about how Ruth Beckett was doing and what she might need. He arranged for her to be in the audience on the night of the taping. He arranged it through her neighbor, a young woman named Clara, who had been helping Ruth with groceries and appointments since the spring. He told Clara only that he wanted Ruth there, and that no one at the show should know who she was or why she had been invited. Ruth was told she was receiving a ticket as part of a viewer appreciation program. She dressed carefully that evening in a dark blue dress she had owned for 20 years. She took a car that Harrison had arranged and did not know he had arranged. She sat in the third row from the back. Harrison Ford knew exactly where she was sitting. He had been told the seat number. He did not look at that part of the audience when he walked out. He was waiting. He had asked the sound team, through his own producer, to play the recording at a specific moment in the interview, after the fourth question, just beneath the conversation level. He had given them the file himself. He had said, "Not loud, just present, just so she knows I heard it." Now, in the present, on the stage, Harrison Ford said again, "Play it again." The sound engineer played it again. Ruth Beckett's voice, low and clear, came through the studio speakers a second time. 3 words, the same 3 words she had spoken at the opening of the recording she had made in her apartment near the Marquette Bells, sitting at her table with a cup of tea cooling beside her, reading herself aloud for the last time. "I hear you." Harrison Ford stood up from his chair. He stood the way men stand who have spent 80 years learning to do things without making more of them than they are, completely, without drama, in one motion. He turned toward the back of the studio. He looked at the third row from the back. He said, not into the microphone, just into the room, "Ruth." A woman in a dark blue dress stood up. She was 91 years old, and she stood up straight, the way she had always stood, the way she had sat straight in the doctor's chair in the spring. She lifted one hand, a small wave, the kind that says "I'm here" without needing to say anything more. Harrison Ford walked off the Tonight Show stage, not urgently, not running. He walked through the gap in the cameras and down the 3 steps from the stage to the studio floor and up the aisle, past 300 people who had gone completely still, past Jimmy Fallon, who had risen from his chair and was standing behind the desk with his hands at his sides and his eyes full and not bothering to hide it. And he walked to the third row from the back, and he stopped in front of Ruth Beckett, and he looked at her for a moment. She said, "You got my letter." He said, "I got your letter." She said, "I wasn't sure you'd remember." He said, "Ruth." She said, "I know." He sat down in the empty seat beside her. Just sat down, in the audience, in his suit, and 300 strangers held their breath around him. He reached into his jacket and produced a rubber band, old, dried at the edges, the kind that cracks when you flex it. He held it out to her in his palm. He said, "I kept every one. Yours too." "I always had a rubber band around mine." Her hand came up and covered his. She did not take the rubber band. She just held his hand around it, her fingers steady over his for a long moment. Jimmy Fallon was sitting on the edge of his desk with both hands pressed over his mouth. The audience rose the way audiences rise when they have forgotten they are an audience, not all at once, not on cue, but person by person, each one standing when they could no longer remain seated, until all 300 of them were on their feet, and the sound of it filled the studio and went up into the rigging and came back down. Ruth Elaine Beckett passed away in January 2023, 3 months after the taping, at home, near the window, with the bells audible in the distance. The rubber band Harrison Ford had given her was found in her palm. Clara placed it back in the shoebox with the letters. The shoebox was sent, at Ruth's written request, to Harrison Ford, who received it on a Tuesday morning and carried it inside from the doorstep himself, and did not open it that day. He opened it the following morning. He sat with it for a long time. There was a note on top of the letters, in Ruth's handwriting, in the precise and unhurried hand of a woman who had spent 60 years teaching people to hear what was underneath the surface of things. It said, you listened. That was always enough. The upright piano from her mother's house was donated to a public school in Milwaukee's South Side, where it sits in a music room that smells like chalk and radiator heat, and children play it badly and beautifully every single day. On the inside of the fallboard, in old ink barely visible now, someone wrote a name, not Ruth's. Someone before her. The piano carries all of them forward, note by note, into rooms they never imagined. Some recordings outlast the silence they were made to fill.